ancient tale carried by wind and starlight. The Watcher and the Walking Man. A bedtime story drawn from the traditions of the Book of Enoch. Chapter the First. The Man Who Walked with the Evening. In the long, unhurried ages before the world had grown loud, there lived a man who loved the quiet hour between sunset and dark. His name was Enoch, and he was the seventh of the fathers, born into a time when the hills were still young and the rivers had not yet learned all their songs. He was not a man of great armies or loud proclamations. He was a man of slow footsteps and upward eyes, a man who noticed things, the way dew gathered on the hollow of a stone, the way certain stars arrived at the same moment each season, as though they, too, kept appointments. He tended small flocks in the cool of the mornings and returned always before the heat grew fierce. But it was the evening that called to him most deeply, that particular hush when the sky slides from pale amber into blue, and the first stars lean out from the dimming, and the air tastes faintly of cedar and distant rain. He would walk out alone then, barefoot when the ground was warm, wrapped in rough cloth when the night wind carried its bite down from the northern heights. He walked with no particular destination, which is the truest kind of walking. He walked along the crests of low hills, where the grasses rustled and bent like sleeping things disturbed by a gentle dream. He walked past the old stone wells, where the frogs began their evening chorus, one voice at a time, until the whole well mouth rang with it. He walked down into the dry river valleys, where the pebbles shone white as milk in the last of the daylight, and he stood there sometimes, simply standing, listening to the silence that lives underneath all sound. The people of his village found him pleasant enough, though slightly puzzling. They could not quite account for the look that came over his face in those evening hours, a look not of sadness, not of joy exactly, but of something like recognition, as though he were seeing, in the ordinary dusk, the faint outline of something vast and familiar. His wife knew that look, and did not call him back when it came over him. She understood, in the way that people who love quietly often understand, that he was not leaving her when he walked out into the evening. He was simply going to the place inside himself that required open sky and stars in order to breathe properly. Enoch had children, and they were gentle as he was. He taught them the names of the stars not as dry points of light, but as living things with characters and paths and dignities. He showed them how certain stars rose at the same time as certain winds, and how the 7 moving lights in the sky followed courses that could be trusted the way a river could be trusted to find the sea. He told them that the sky was not empty above the sky they could see, that there were layers to the heavens, rooms beyond rooms, lights beyond lights, and that all of it was in order. An order so deep and so old that it had no beginning that anyone living could remember. He was not frightening when he spoke of such things. He spoke of them the way an elder speaks of a far country he has once visited in youth, with warmth and specificity, and a quiet longing that is more sweet than bitter. And the children listened and then slept, and dreamed of silver paths winding through a darkness that was not frightening, but simply wide, the way the sea is wide, the way the night sky above a sleeping plain is wide, a wideness that holds rather than threatens. In those days, the world was older and younger at once. Older because the mountains had been standing since before memory, and the rivers ran in channels so ancient they seemed to have been carved not by water, but by time itself. Younger, because certain things were still possible that later became impossible. The boundary between the seen and the unseen was thinner then, more like linen than stone, and those who walked quietly and paid attention could sometimes feel, in the air just before dawn, or in the particular quality of light that falls on still water at midsummer, a faint pressure, a warmth, the sense of nearness, as though the world were attended by something that loved it. Enoch felt this often. He did not have a name for it. He called it, when he tried to describe it to his wife, the presence behind the stars. And she nodded, without pressing him to be more precise, because she had felt it herself on certain mornings when the light came over the eastern hills with unusual gentleness, and the air smelled of something nameless and good. He kept a kind of inner ledger, did Enoch, not written, for writing was still rare, but held carefully in his memory, the way careful people hold things they do not want to lose. He noted the movements of the great lights. He noted the 7 stars that traveled together in a loose company across the seasons. He noted the fixed stars that stood like sentinels at the 4 corners of the sky and did not wander. He noted the deep redness of certain stars near the horizon and the blue-white coldness of others at the zenith. And he wondered about their differences the way a child wonders about the differences between faces, not analytically, but with gentle curiosity, with the desire to know things by their names. The mountains to the north were visible from his hillside on clear evenings, blue-gray and enormous, wearing their caps of snow even in summer. The tallest of them, the great peak that men called Hermon, rose above the others like a seated elder above a gathering, patient, immovable, very old. Enoch watched it often. There was something about it that drew his eyes, something about the way clouds gathered around its upper reaches even on still days, something about the way it caught the last light of the evening and held it long after the valleys below had gone dark, as though the mountain were reluctant to let the day go, or as though the day were reluctant to leave it. He did not know then what the mountain held. He did not know what had occurred there in the season of his grandfather's grandfather, when the sky itself had leaned down toward that high place and something had come through, not violently, not with fire and noise, but with the terrible quiet of things that have no need of noise because they carry their own authority. He did not know, but he sensed the mountain's weight in the landscape, the way certain places hold weight, the weight of old happenings, of decisions made long ago, whose consequences were still unfolding, the way a stone dropped into still water continues to send out rings long after it has settled to the bottom. He had a grove of trees near his house, planted by his father, who had planted them in memory of his own father, and so on back until the trees themselves were the memory. Fig trees, mostly, thick-trunked and slow, with bark like wrinkled cloth, and leaves that caught the afternoon light and held it, dappling the ground beneath in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. In the evenings, the grove was cool and smelled of sun-warmed earth and the faint sweetness of ripening fruit, and Enoch would sit there sometimes at the day's end, his back against one of the older trees, and simply be. It was in the grove one evening, in the 7th month of a year when the rains had been especially gentle and the crops had come in full and heavy, that something changed. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply changed, the way the quality of air changes when a weather front moves through, or the way a room changes when a door opens somewhere far away and a new smell enters. Enoch was sitting in his accustomed place, his eyes half closed, watching the last light move through the fig leaves, when he became aware of a sound he could not at first identify. It was low, sustained, and came from no particular direction, or rather from all directions at once, the way the sound of the wind sometimes does, arriving from everywhere and nowhere. It was not music exactly, though it resembled music the way a river resembles a song, organized, purposeful, and beautiful in a way that did not require a listener in order to be beautiful. He sat very still. The sound did not increase or decrease. It was simply present, the way starlight is present, without effort, without announcement, just there. And with it came the smell he had sometimes caught before in morning air, the nameless good smell, now stronger and more distinct, like warm stone and high winds, and something older than both. He breathed it in slowly, his heart quiet, his hands open on his knees, and the evening deepened around him, and the first stars appeared, and the frogs at the well began their chorus, and still the sound continued, faint and sustained and untroubled. Then it was gone, and the evening was simply the evening again, the fig leaves darkening, the air cooling, the frogs singing, the stars multiplying overhead. Enoch rose, slowly, and walked back toward his house, where a lamp was burning in the window, and his family was gathered inside around the warmth of the hearth. He went in, and he did not speak of what he had heard, but he held it carefully, the way he held his inner ledger, in the place inside himself where the things that mattered lived. Chapter the 2nd. The Descent upon Hermon. Long before Enoch's own walking years, in the deeper time that memory only reaches by way of story and fire and the slow cadence of an elder's voice at evening, there had been a great descending. This is what the old tales said, and the old tales were older than the elders who told them, passed down through the long chain of generations, the way a lamp is passed from hand to hand in a dark corridor, each hand warming the flame with its own heat before giving it on. The ones who descended were called, in the oldest tongue, the Watchers, the Irin, the ones who did not sleep, the ones whose nature was to observe and attend and minister to the vast orders of things. They had names, each of them, and the names were like keys to particular qualities. Shemihaza, who led them, whose name carried in it the sound of watching and height. Azazel, whose nature was brilliance and whose gifts were double-edged as a bright blade, and others, Armaros, Barakel, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, names that rang like struck bronze in the deep registers of the old stories, names that meant things: lightning, star of God, thunder of God, height of God, each one a small window into a nature grander and stranger than the human. 200 of them, the old accounts said, though 200 might be the way the very old stories hold the idea of a great many, a gathering so significant that it required a number with weight to it, a number that settled in the ear and stayed. Whatever the precise count, the accounts agreed on this: they came down together, in agreement, in a compact, each one binding himself to the others by a shared oath, as though they knew beforehand that what they were doing required the gravity of a promise to sustain it against the pull of doubt. And they chose Hermon, the great mountain with its snow cap and its old silence and its gathering of clouds. They alighted there. This is the word the stories use, alighted, as birds alight, as light itself alights on a surface. And the mountain received them without visible disturbance, the way deep water receives a stone, closing over it with barely a ripple, though somewhere in its depth everything has been rearranged. Why did they come down? The oldest accounts give the reason with simple directness, without shame or concealment. They saw the daughters of men, and they were moved by what they saw. This is told not with harshness, but with the plain matter-of-factness of a people who understood that beauty is a force, like gravity, like fire, and that even the greatest natures are not beyond its pull. The daughters of men were beautiful, and the watchers loved beauty, as all beings of light love beauty, not perversely, but with a depth of appreciation that was itself a gift, if perhaps a gift that needed boundaries they had not yet learned to draw for themselves. And so they descended, and they chose, and they built lives in that high country at the foot of the great mountain, and for a time there was wonder in it, not terror, wonder. The people of the valley looked at the ones who had come among them, and saw in their faces a luminosity that was not quite like firelight, and not quite like sunlight, but resembled both, a quality of light that seemed to come from within rather than from without, and that made everything near it seem more vivid, more itself, more real. And there was a strangeness in their presence that was not frightening, but bracing, like cold, clear water, like a wind off the high snows that makes the lungs feel suddenly larger. Shemihaza was the eldest among them, or so the stories say, the first among equals, who had first proposed the oath upon the mountain, and who felt most deeply the weight of the choice. He was not cruel, he was not reckless, he was something more complicated, vast in nature, ancient in the ways of the upper world, and yet genuinely moved by the world below in a way he had not foreseen and could not easily govern. He watched the valleys with the same deep attention he had once given to the ordering of stars and seasons, and he found them beautiful and strange and full of a kind of aching particularity, the way every human face was different, the way every morning was different, the way grief and joy could live in the same heart in the same moment, and how this was not contradiction, but the most characteristic thing about the human nature. He loved this about the world below. He could not help it. Love is not always chosen, even by those whose nature contains more choice than the ordinary. And Azaziel was different from the rest in that his gifts were of a particular and technical kind. He knew things about the world's material nature that the people below had not yet worked out for themselves, things about the hidden properties of metal and stone, things about the way fire could be shaped and directed, things about pigments and dyes and the chemistry of color. He began, with the generous impulse of one who loves to teach, to share these things, and so knowledge moved down from the high places into the hands of men and women who had not arrived at it through the slow, patient path of discovery, but received it whole and fully formed, like bread given rather than grown, like water carried rather than drawn. There was beauty in what they made with this knowledge. There was ingenuity, craft, artistry that surprised even the teachers. The people of the valleys learned the working of metals, and they made things of copper and iron that gleamed in the firelight, tools and ornaments and, it must be said, weapons, because knowledge of this kind does not sort itself neatly into the useful and the dangerous, but offers itself whole, and human hands do with it what human nature inclines to do. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, the way certain sounds and arrangements of words could act upon the hidden structures of things. Barakel taught the signs of lightning, the reading of storms, the way the sky speaks in electrical language to those who know how to listen. Kokabel taught the knowledge of the stars, not the simple knowledge of their names and positions, which the good teachers also gave, but deeper things, the way the positions of the stars could be read as a language, a slow grammar of influence and timing. Tamil taught the reading of the deep sky. Ramiel taught the signs that can be read in the way clouds gather and disperse. All of this knowledge was, in its nature, neither good nor ill. It was simply knowledge, the kind that a world still young had not yet grown into on its own. But knowledge given without the maturity to hold it rightly is like a river given new channels before the banks have been shaped. It spreads, and the spreading is not always orderly, and what was a gift can become, not through malice, but through the gap between the giver's wisdom and the receiver's readiness, something heavier than intended.
The years passed. The old accounts are not precise about how many, because time in that era moved differently, or at least was counted differently, by a people whose eldest members lived for spans that would now seem impossible, long, slow centuries of individual life, during which a single human could watch mountains change their shape, could see rivers alter their courses, could observe the slow migration of whole peoples from one valley to another over generations that in earlier ages would have constituted the whole span of a lineage. And in those years, the earth changed. This is how the old accounts describe it, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow inevitability of weather, as the patterns that had been set in motion by the watchers descending worked their way through the fabric of the world below. The population grew, and grew faster than before. The knowledge spread, and with it the things that knowledge makes possible, abundance and scarcity both, beauty and its shadow, the arts of making and the arts of taking. The valleys that had been quiet grew loud. The hills that had been undisturbed grew marked with the evidence of human presence, the cleared fields, the worn paths, the heaps of stone that were houses, the smoke of 10,000 pook fires rising into the dawn sky, visible from a great distance, visible from a very great distance indeed, visible, as the stories say, from above. Chapter the 3rd. The Earth Grows Heavy. There is a quality that the old stories give to the world at this time, a heaviness. Not the good heaviness of full granaries, of ripe fruit on heavy branches, of well-fed children sleeping deeply. This was a different kind of heaviness, a density, a saturation, as though the earth had taken on more than it could easily carry, as though the air itself had grown thick with the accumulated weight of choices made in haste, of powers used without the patience to understand them, of the particular kind of sorrow that gathers in places where the natural order of things has been hurried beyond its capacity to absorb. The old stories speak of this carefully, without judgment that is not also tinged with sorrow, because the people of the earth were not wicked in the simple sense. They were not, most of them, people who chose evil with full knowledge of its nature. They were people who had been given gifts before they were ready to hold them gently, people who had inherited a world that was changing faster than their wisdom could grow to match it. They loved their children and their animals and their rivers. They made beautiful things. The knowledge of pigments led to paintings on cave walls and house walls and temple walls, paintings of animals and stars and human figures that had a freshness and aliveness to them that could still, centuries later, stop the breath of those who found them. They sang. They grieved properly and buried their dead with tenderness and left small offerings at the graves that were not grim but hopeful, bread for the journey, oil for the dark. And yet, the earth was heavy. The old accounts say that the cries of it went up, the earth's own voice, whatever that means, the complaint of a living thing that has been pushed past its comfortable weight. And those cries went up through the layers of the sky, through the progressively finer and more luminous strata of the heavens, until they arrived at the place where the great ones dwelt, the ones who were not watchers in the sense of those who had descended, but watchers in the deeper sense, the ones whose attention was not divided between above and below, but fixed in the heights with an unbroken steadiness. Their names were Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, and they are among the most ancient names in the old stories, names worn smooth by repetition, by the many times they have been called upon in prayer and invocation, and the fearful hope of those who needed something stronger than themselves. Michael, whose name means something like, "Who is like God?" A question, not a statement, rhetorical in its nature, carrying in itself the answer, no one. Gabriel, whose name carries the sense of the strength of God, not the strength of armies, but the strength of deep foundations, of mountains at their roots, of the thing that does not move when everything around it moves. Raphael, the healing one, whose name holds within it the ancient word for the mending of what has been broken, the setting of what has been dislocated, the restoration of what has been disordered. And Uriel, the fire of God, the one whose light is not the soft light of lamps, but the clarifying light of understanding, the light that shows things as they are rather than as we fear or hope them to be. These four were among those who heard. Not with ears, they had no ears in the way we understand ears, no physical apparatus of canal and membrane and tiny bone. They perceived, which is the only word adequate to the kind of knowing that does not require the body's instruments, the kind of knowing that is more like recognition than acquisition, more like remembering than learning. And what they perceived from their station in the heights was the heaviness of the world below, its accumulated weight, its straining, the way a canvas strains when it has been filled beyond its intended capacity. They saw the watchers among men. They saw what had come of the descending. They saw Shemihazah in the valleys with his children, who were very large and very strong, and moved through the world with an appetite that matched their size. They saw Azazel's teachings spreading outward from their origins in intricate branching patterns, the way a crack in old plaster spreads, not with malice, but with the simple inevitability of pressure finding weakness. They saw the beauty of what had been made, and they saw its cost, and they held both in their perception simultaneously, without needing to resolve the tension into a simpler verdict, because they were capable of seeing whole. And they brought what they perceived before the one they called in those accounts the Great One, or the Lord of the Age, or the Head of Days, a name that is not a name so much as a gesture toward something that cannot be named without being diminished, the way pointing at the sun is not the same as naming it, and naming it is not the same as comprehending it. The ancient stories do not try to describe this presence in terms of body or form or location, because the presence they are pointing toward is not the kind of thing that has a location in the way a mountain has a location, or a form in the way a cedar has a form. They simply say, the great ones brought their perception before the highest, and the highest received it, and considered, and in the considering, something was set in motion. The motion was not violent. The stories are particular about this. It was not the motion of retribution in the sense of fury, not the motion of a hand striking. It was the motion of a vast mechanism returning to its natural calibration after a period of strain, the way a river returns to its old course after a flood has temporarily diverted it, the way a set of scales comes back to level after an excessive weight has been placed and then removed. There was intention in it, and purpose, and the purpose was not punishment as an end in itself, but restoration, the restoration of the order that made abundance possible, that made beauty possible, that made the very existence of the world below something that could continue without becoming too heavy to hold. And yet, the earth was heavy. The old accounts say that the cries of it went up, the earth's own voice, whatever that means, the complaint of a living thing that has been pushed past its comfortable weight. And those cries went up through the layers of the sky, through the progressively finer and more luminous strata of the heavens, until they arrived at the place where the great ones dwelt, the ones who were not watchers in the sense of those who had descended, but watchers in the deeper sense, the ones whose attention was not divided between above and below, but fixed in the heights with an unbroken steadiness. Chapter the 4th. The Calling of the Walking Man. It came to him in sleep the first time. This was not unusual. The first time such things come, they often choose sleep as the medium, because sleep is the state in which the usual defenses of the ordinary mind are lowered, in which the gates between the person and the wider world of perception stand a little more open, in which the self is both more vulnerable and receptive than in waking. Enoch was a man who slept well, who lay down with his wife in the warmth of their house and descended into sleep the way one descends into still water, smoothly, without struggle, with a kind of relief. But this sleep was different from the beginning. It had a weight to it, a quality of significance, the way certain atmospheres have before a great weather change, a stillness that is not emptiness, but fullness, a quiet that is not absence, but the gathering of something that has not yet declared itself. He sank into it more deeply than usual, past the shallow level where half-formed thoughts drift and dissolve, past the level of the simple images of the day replayed and shuffled, down to a depth where the dreamscape had an unusual clarity, not the sharp-edged clarity of waking perception, but a different kind, softer at the edges, and yet more intensely present at the center. The way candlelight makes what it illuminates more vivid precisely because the surrounding dark is so complete. He was standing, in the dream, on his hillside, the familiar hillside, the one he had walked 1,000 times at evening, with the fig grove to the right and the well to the left and the path running down toward the valley. But the sky was wrong, not wrong in a frightening way, wrong in the way of something that is more than it usually is, intensified beyond its daily version of itself. The stars were more numerous than he had ever seen them, and more various, not the familiar scatter of white and gold against darkness, but a population of lights of many colors and sizes, some moving slowly across the sky in stately arcs, some stationary in configurations he had never seen before, some so bright they cast faint shadows on the ground at his feet. And in the dream he was not alone. There was a presence to his left, not a figure exactly, not something with definite human shape, but a concentration of light and warmth that had the quality of a personality, of an individual nature, the way a voice has a quality that identifies the one speaking before you have processed the words. This presence was not alarming, it was not alien. It was, if anything, familiar in the deep sense of belonging to a category of things that he had always known existed but had not previously encountered face to face, or whatever the equivalent of face to face is when one of the faces is not a face in the ordinary sense. The presence spoke, or communicated, because the sound it made was not entirely sound, was not entirely words, was more like the direct insertion of meaning into the place in him where understanding lives, bypassing the slow mechanism of ear and nerve and language center, and arriving already whole and comprehensible in a way that was more like remembering than hearing. And what it communicated was this, that he was seen, that he was known, that what he had been doing in his evenings was not vanity or wandering, but the preparation of an instrument, that the listening he had done, the upward looking, the willingness to stay open when openness required the patience to sit with uncertainty and not demand resolution, all of this had made him suited for something, suited for a journey, suited to be a messenger, a carrier of words between the high and the low, suited to be the one who saw and then told of what he saw, so that the telling would persist after him, the way a lamp placed in a niche in a wall persists after the one who lit it has gone on their way. He woke with the dawn, and the feeling of the dream did not fade the way dreams usually fade, did not blur and dissipate like morning mist under sun, but remained present at the edges of his awareness, like a warmth that had not yet left the stones, even though the fire that made them warm was not currently burning. He lay still for a long time, watching the light grow on the ceiling of his house, and he did not feel afraid. He felt, which was stranger, a kind of acceptance, not resignation, not the passive acceptance of one who has no choice, but the active acceptance of one who recognizes something they have been expecting without knowing what to call it. The dream came again on the following night, and the night after that, and each time it grew more distinct, more specific, more elaborated. The presence to his left was joined, in the third dream, by another, a figure this time, something that had chosen to be seen as a form of some kind, a form that stood upright and had a face of sorts, though the face was not easy to look at directly, not because it was terrible, but because it was too bright, too much itself, the way the direct face of the sun cannot be looked at without averting the eyes, not because the sun is hostile, but because the eye is not built for that much light at once. He did not look at the face directly. He looked at the hands, which were visible and which held. He had to look twice, and in the dream a double look was possible in a way it is not in waking. A scroll. Not a scroll of papyrus or hide as he knew scrolls, but something that resembled those things the way a river resembles water in a cup. The same element, but in a scale and living quality that the small container cannot fully suggest. The scroll seemed to breathe faintly, as living things breathe, and the script upon it was not in any language he recognized, and yet he understood it with the same bypassing of ordinary mechanism that the earlier communications had employed. It contained, the scroll, or rather it communicated through him, the shape of what was to come, not in the sense of a list of events, but in the way a piece of music contains its own development. You cannot extract the ending from the beginning and describe it, because the ending's meaning depends entirely on what has come before, on the accumulated weight of all the notes and silences that precede it. But the shape of it was there, and the shape was this, that a restoration was intended, that the heaviness of the world was not to be its permanent condition, that the order which had been present at the beginning, the order of which those moving lights in the sky were the outward sign, the great celestial clock running faithfully, season to season, year to year, without deviation or fatigue, that order was not lost, only strained, and what was strained could be restored. And then the scroll folded, and the figure whose face was too bright to look at directly seemed to step back, though in the dream space direction and distance were not quite what they were in the waking world, and Enoch was again alone on his hillside under the intensified sky, and the stars moved in their great slow arcs, and the night was neither cold nor warm, but simply present. And he stood in it as he had stood so many evenings in his life, barefoot, open-palmed, watching. Chapter the 5th. The First Heaven, the Palace of Winds. When the actual journey came, not in dream, but in that state the old accounts describe as being taken up, carried, translated from one mode of existence temporarily into another, without the body being left behind, but also without the body being the primary instrument of experience, it came quietly, without announcement, without drama. He was in his grove again, at evening, and the sound he had heard months before, the low, sustained sound with no source and no direction, was present again, and this time, instead of fading, it deepened, and the deepening brought with it a sense of motion. Not the motion of walking, not the motion of being carried like a child or a parser, something subtler, the motion of a perspective expanding, the way a view expands when you climb from a valley to a hilltop and the landscape spreads around you. Except that here it was not a landscape, but a mode of being that expanded, a sense of the horizon of perception moving outward in all directions simultaneously, taking in more, becoming capable of receiving more, the way the eye adjusts in darkness until things that were invisible become visible, not because they have changed, but because the eye has grown larger for the task. He rose, or the world fell away below him. These may be the same thing described from different vantage points. The fig trees diminished, the hillside shrank, the valley with its well and its worn paths and its scatter of houses with their lamplight in the windows, all of it became small, and then smaller, and then a pattern of small things in a larger pattern, the way a tile becomes a detail in a mosaic when you step back far enough to see the whole image. He could see from this expanding height the wide plain, and beyond it the mountains, and beyond them, in the dimming distances, the sea. The first time he had seen the sea from above, and it was very large and very still and very dark, and it caught the last of the sun in long flat gleams that were beautiful and strange. And then there was cloud around him, not the cloud of a thunderstorm, dense and dark and charged with the threat of lightning, but a different cloud, the kind that lives very high, the kind that has no weight to it, that is more suggestion than substance, that filters light rather than blocking it. He passed through it, and it was neither wet nor dry, but simply a texture in the air, a transition, a threshold. Beyond it was the first of the levels, the first of what the accounts call the heavens, using the plural deliberately, carefully, because there is more than one, many more than one, the world above the world being not a single room, but a vast house of rooms, each with its own character and purpose and population. The first was the heaven of winds. He perceived this before he understood it, the sensation of air moving in currents and countercurrents, not the random gusts of the ground-level world, but something organized, purposeful, the way the currents of a great river are organized, even when they seem to flow in contradictory directions. The deep current running one way, the surface current another, the back eddies spinning in their small circles, and all of it serving the movement of the whole. Here was where the winds were kept, the old accounts say, not kept as prisoners are kept, confined and restrained against their will, but kept as a treasury keeps its contents, ordered and available, each wind in its appointed place, each season's wind ready to be sent out at the appointed time. There were angels here. This is the word the old accounts use, though the word as we use it carries connotations that may not have been present in the original telling, the connotation of the small winged figures of later art, the chubby cherubs and the slender messengers with their lily wands. What Enoch perceived were not these things. They were more like qualities of attention that had been given form, qualities of focused purpose, of precise and patient ministry, of the kind of competence that carries no pride in itself because it is entirely absorbed in the work. They moved among the chambers of wind with the ease and familiarity of skilled craftspeople in a workshop they have known for a very long time, adjusting, releasing, holding back, calibrating. They did not speak to Enoch or notice him particularly, or if they noticed him, they gave no sign, absorbed as they were in the intricate business of managing the world's weather from this first great height. He watched them for what felt like a long time, though time in that place had a different texture, not the linear progression of the world below, each moment following the previous one like beads on a string, but something more like a chord, multiple moments sounding simultaneously, a present that was also past and future in some inextricable way that he could sense without being able to fully parse. He watched the winds being gathered and sorted, and the ones appointed for the north being sent northward in slow, organized processions, and the warm south winds being held ready in their great warm chambers for the spring, and the rain winds being mixed with their moisture from the stores of cloud substance that filled certain vast halls like great soft heaps of something between wool and water, white and faintly luminous and sweet-smelling, as rain smells from a distance when the wind carries it toward you on a summer afternoon. In one of the halls, he paused before something that fascinated him and did not release him for a long while, the repository of snow. It was not cold in the way snow on the ground is cold. It was simply itself, a contained brightness, white beyond white, piled in forms that suggested softness without being soft to the touch, because there was no touching here in the ordinary sense, no physical contact. But the impression of softness was complete and unambiguous, the impression of something that had been made to fall gently and to cover gently and to lie on the world with the delicate weight of feathers on a sleeping face. The snow in its repository was ready and waiting for the appointed times and places, the mountain passes that required sealing in certain seasons, the fields that needed the slow water of a melting snowpack to feed the springs in the dry months, the high plateaus that had been cold for so long they required the insulation of snow to keep what warmth was left in them from seeping away entirely into the dark of space above.
He saw this, the purpose of it, not as an intellectual understanding, but as a direct knowing, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, even when there is no body present as such. He understood snow for the first time in this chamber of the first heaven, understood it as a part of the vast system of the world's self-tending, the intricate and beautiful machinery by which the world sustained itself season to season, the great slow breathing of a living thing that breathed in geological time rather than in the time of heartbeats. There was great beauty in it. He had not expected, or perhaps he had always expected, without knowing it, that the machinery of the world would be beautiful. He had half imagined, in the vague and unexamined way that one half imagines things without committing to the imagining, that the underlying workings of things would be mechanical in the diminished sense, utilitarian, efficient, without ornament. But everything he saw in the first heaven was both efficient and beautiful, functional and lovely, in the way that the best things made by the best craftspeople are both at once, where you cannot say where the usefulness ends and the artistry begins, because they are not separate qualities applied to the same object, but a single quality perceived from two angles. Chapter the 6th. The Second Heaven, the Crystal Halls. The passage from the first heaven to the second was not marked by any gate or door or announcement. It was more like the change between one room and the next when the connecting passage is very gradual, a slow shift in the quality of light, in the texture of the air, in the temperature that was not temperature in the physical sense, but something analogous to it, some quality of the ambient condition that the perception registered as warmth or coolness, even in the absence of skin. The second heaven was made, or appeared to be made, or presented itself as being made, of crystal. This is the word the accounts use, consistently, across the multiple times this vision is described. Crystal. Not glass, which is made, but crystal, which is grown. The distinction matters because grown things have a different quality than made things, the quality of having arrived at their form through time and process and the patient work of forces much larger than any individual intention. Crystal accumulates its clarity one molecule at a time, over periods that dwarf the human lifespan. And the clarity it achieves is therefore not the clarity of something polished to transparency, but the clarity of something that has become fully itself, by ordering its internal structure so completely that light passes through without obstruction, not because the crystal has been emptied, but because it has been filled. The halls of the second heaven were like this. They were vast. He could not see their ends, though ends were implied by the way the walls angled away into distance and the ceiling arched above with the regularity of an intended structure. The walls were not entirely clear. They were shot through with colors that shifted as the angle of perception shifted, the faint blue-green of certain deep ocean water, the violet of high-altitude sky at the horizon, the amber that appears in certain crystals when light strikes them at a specific angle,
the soft gray-white of clouds seen from above. These colors moved, slowly, not randomly, but in response to something, some principle of order that governed the patterns, the way mathematics governs the patterns of a wave or a snowflake, not imposing order from outside, but expressing order from within. And here, in the second heaven, there were beings of a different kind, not the efficient ministering ones of the first heaven, absorbed in their practical tasks. These were beings in a state of rest, or something that resembled rest, gathered, quiet, their light, for they had a light that was their own, as distinct from the light of the crystal halls, somewhat dimmed, as a lamp is dimmed when the flame is turned low, not because it is failing, but because it is in a mode of sustaining rather than illuminating. He did not know at first who they were or why they were there, but the knowing that came to him in this place, the direct knowing, bypassing the mechanisms of analysis and inference, gave him their story quietly, the way a gentle voice tells a story, without emphasis, without the drama of revelation. They were the ones who had been sent at some time in the vast past to watch over the world below, and had failed in their watching, not through malice, not through defection, but through a failure of proportion, a failure to maintain the distance that their task required, a falling into the world they were meant to observe from above. Not the watchers of Shinihaza's company, but an earlier cohort, or a parallel one, or perhaps the stories of the two were woven together in the telling, and the telling distinguished them less clearly than the experience itself had done. They were not suffering. He was careful to note this in the old accounts. He noted what he saw, not what he expected or feared to see. And what he saw was not suffering, but a kind of stillness that was between states, a waiting without knowing what was being waited for, a dimming that was neither extinction nor resumption, but something in between. They were beautiful, even in this state. Beauty was apparently a quality that persisted through diminishment, like the color of a flower pressed and dried, which is not the color of the living flower, but is still recognizably a color, still lovely in its faded way. He felt for them something that was not pity. Pity requires a sense of superiority to the one pitied, and he felt no such thing, but empathy in the precise sense, the ability to imagine, from inside one's own experience, something of what another experience might be like. He had never been a watcher in the high sense, but he had been a person who felt the pull of the world's beauty very strongly, who walked into the evening because the evening was beautiful, and the stars were beautiful, and the sound of the frogs at the well was beautiful, and the smell of the fig grove at dusk was beautiful, and who could imagine from that experience what it might be like to be in nature vast enough to see the beauty of the whole world at once, from above, and to be moved by it beyond the power to maintain the proper distance. He walked, or moved, or was carried, or simply found himself through the crystal halls without urgency, without needing to be anywhere in particular or to accomplish anything in particular. This was part of the nature of this journey. It was as much witnessing as it was traveling, as much receiving as it was going. The halls branched and curved and opened into chambers of different sizes, and in each chamber the crystal was slightly different, slightly more or less clear, slightly different in its coloration, slightly different in the patterns of its internal light. And these differences were not imperfections, but variations in a system of variations that was itself an ordering principle. The way a musical scale includes many notes precisely because the variations between them create the possibility of melody. In one chamber there was a kind of pool, or the impression of a pool, a level surface that caught and reflected the light of the crystal around it, and in the reflections showed not the ceiling above, but something else, some other scene, the way mirrors in old stories show not the viewer, but the truth.
What he saw in this pool's surface he did not fully understand, though he stayed and looked at it for what felt like a very long time. He saw, or thought he saw, the world below, tiny in the distance of the pool's depth, spread out like a map, with all its valleys and rivers and mountains, and the smoke of its fires rising in thin gray threads into the blue of its sky. And he saw, laid over this image like a transparent second image, the pattern of what the world had been and what it might yet become. The pattern of the order that had been present at the beginning, and that was not gone but muted, not destroyed but buried under the accumulated heaviness of the present age, the way a clear spring is buried under silt, but does not cease to flow, only flows underground, awaiting the pressure that will clear the channel and bring it back to light. He saw this and held it, the image of the buried spring flowing still beneath the weight, and something in him that had been tight, some cord of worry for the world below that he had not known he was carrying, eased slightly. Not released entirely, simply eased. Because the pool showed him that the situation was not, in the deepest sense, lost. It was complicated, it was heavy, it was in need of the very restoration that had been set in motion, but it was not lost. The spring still flowed. The order was still there, beneath the silt, patient and available, waiting to be recovered. Chapter the 7th. The third and fourth heavens, gardens and rivers of fire. The third heaven opened around him with a warmth and sweetness that was almost overwhelming, a richness of sensory impression so dense and so benign that he stood still for a long time simply receiving it, not moving, not analyzing, simply letting it arrive and settle and become familiar before attempting to see it clearly. It was a garden, or had the quality of a garden in the way that a piece of music has the quality of rain without being rain, evocative, suggestive, carrying the essential note of the thing without requiring the thing itself to be literally present. But it was more than evocative. It was real in the way things in the upper regions were real, more real than the world below, not less real. Real with the intensity of a primary color rather than a secondary one. Real in the way that a source is more real than its reflection. There were trees, and the trees were like the trees he had known all his life, fig and cedar and olive, and the great pale-trunked trees of the northern hills, whose name he knew, but that did not translate well into the language of the accounts. And yet they were more themselves than the trees of the world below, as though the trees of the world below were copies of these, faithful copies, but copies nonetheless, and these were the originals, the templates, the idea of tree in which all individual trees participated. The fruit on the trees was ripe and would always be ripe. Not overripe, not the softness of decay, the sweetness of decomposition, simply ripe, at the perfect point, the moment of fullest expression of the fruit's nature, held there not by preservation, but by a different relationship with time, a relationship in which the moment of perfection was not a passing moment, but an enduring condition. He did not eat, not from reluctance, but because the garden was not a place to take from, but a place to receive from. And reception, in that sense, required openness rather than appetite, presence rather than action. The fragrance of the garden was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense of unusual, in the sense of exceeding the ordinary measure, which is the precise meaning of the word, the thing that goes beyond what ordinary experience contains. Every smell that he had loved in the world below, the cedar smell of the northern groves, the thick, sweet smell of fig leaves in summer sun, the smell of rain on dry earth, of bread new baked, of water from deep wells, of honeycomb and of wood smoke, and of the clean, cold smell of high mountain air, all of these were present here not as a confusion of simultaneous sense, but as a harmony,
a chord of fragrance in which each individual element was perfectly distinguishable, and the combination was more than the sum of its parts, the way a chord of music contains each note distinctly and yet produces, in their combination, something that no single note could produce alone. There were other beings in this garden, not ministering ones, not dimmed ones, but beings who were simply there, in the garden, in the way that birds are in a garden, not for the garden's benefit, and not because they have been assigned to it, but because it is the right place for them, the place where their nature finds its most complete expression. They had forms that were loosely human in outline, but not human in quality, or rather, human qualities extended to their fullest expression, as though every human quality had a version of itself that was what it aspired to become, and these beings were that aspired toward version, the way a sketch is the aspired toward version of the final drawing, except in this case the aspiration ran the other way, from below upward, and the original was here. They moved among the trees without urgency, pausing sometimes to stand still in what seemed very like contemplation, the way a person stands in a garden they love and simply breathes it for a moment before moving on. They were beautiful, quietly and not ostentatiously beautiful, beautiful the way the garden itself was beautiful, not as an attribute, not as something they possessed, but as something they were, as a river is wet, not as an attribute, but as a mode of being. Beyond the garden, or at its far edge, which was very far, there was a river, not a river of water, a river of light, or of something that resembled light in the way that a river resembles rain, related but transformed by its new context into something different in kind from what it was before. It moved with the characteristic motion of a river, directional, carrying, purposeful, and it had something like a sound, which was not the sound of water over stones, but the sound of many voices held at the threshold of speech, not quite speaking, not quite singing, something between the two that was its own category of expression, something that felt important and that he attended to with his whole attention without being able to resolve it into meaning the way the other communications had resolved themselves into meaning. He stood at the edge of the light river for a long time. It moved past him with the indifference of truly great things to the attention of small observers. It did not perform for him, did not modulate itself in response to his presence, simply continued in its ancient course with the unself-consciousness of a natural process. This was, he realized slowly, the most comforting thing about it, its absolute continuity, its unconcern with the present emergency of the world below, not because it was indifferent to the world below, but because it was older than the emergency, older than the world, and its existence was the evidence that whatever happened in the worlds below it, the river would continue, the light would keep moving in its channel, the voices at the threshold of speech would continue their almost song. The fourth heaven was reached through the far side of the garden, through a passage that was less a door than a change of quality, the way a clearing in a forest opens not through any gate, but simply through the thinning of the trees, through the gradual arrival of more light and less shade, until you are no longer in forest but in the open, with the sky above you very wide and very blue. He emerged from the passage into a space that was defined by light rather than by walls, or by light that was walls, that had the structural quality of walls, the sense of space contained and ordered, without any of the visual characteristics of stone or crystal or wood. Here were the paths of the sun and moon, the accounts say, the great lights kept here in the highest sense, their visible movements in the sky of the world below being the surface expression of something that occurred at this level, the actual management of the light itself, the decisions, if decisions was the right word, about when the sun would rise and set, about the pace of the moon's cycling, about the precise quality of light appropriate to each hour and season. He watched from this vantage the sun's path being maintained, not by effort, not by the anxious exertion of beings who feared what would happen if they stopped, but with the ease and pleasure of beings doing something they had been doing since before any living thing had eyes to see the light that resulted, with the deep satisfaction of work that has found its rhythm and sustains itself. Chapter the 8th. The fifth and sixth heavens, the star chambers and the archive of time. Higher still, and the nature of the journey shifted again. The earlier heavens had been perceivable in terms of something, garden, crystal, wind, light, that corresponded to something in the world below, that could be named by analogy even if not by direct description. The fifth heaven was harder. The fifth heaven required the perception itself to expand in order to accommodate what was there, and expansion of perception is not painless. Not painful in the physical sense, but requiring, in a different mode, the same kind of courage and willingness that it takes to look at something one has been avoiding, to acknowledge something one has been refusing to know. Here were the star chambers, not metaphorical chambers, not the way one might speak of the sun's chambers, meaning simply its influence, but actual chambers, as real in the fifth heaven as rooms are real in a house, in which the stars themselves, or the essential reality of which the visible stars are the expression, had their existence. Not kept here as objects in a display, not pinned like specimens to a board, but dwelling here as beings dwell in their natural element, the way fish dwell in water, naturally and completely, with no sense of being contained. The stars were beings. This is what the fifth heaven revealed. Not in the comfortable, simple way of a children's story, not anthropomorphized as little figures with 5 points and cheerful faces, but beings in the full and serious sense, entities with natures, with purposes, with something that in the human world would be called character, a particular consistent quality of being that distinguished each from the others in the way that human individuals are distinguished by their particular consistent qualities. Their beauty was extreme, and their variety was extreme, and their number was so far beyond what Enoch had ever imagined that the old accounts abandon the attempt at specific numbering and simply say, "He saw the stars in their multitudes," and the multitude was beyond the capacity of any numbering he possessed. Each star had its path. This was the primary thing he perceived. Not a path in the sense of a track worn in the dirt by repeated passage, but the path in the deeper sense of a purpose, an appointed course, a trajectory through time and space that was not arbitrary, but precisely fitted to the role the star played in the vast system of the worlds. No star wandered without purpose, no moved without direction. The apparent randomness of the night sky, the stars scattered as if thrown, was not random at all seen from here, but a pattern of immense complexity and precision, like a weaving seen from too close, where the individual threads seem to go in many directions, but from the right distance reveals itself as a unified design. He saw also the stars that the accounts call the 7 wanderers, the ones that moved against the fixed backdrop, that had always drawn his particular attention on his evening walks, the bright ones that changed their positions night to night and season to season, and whose movements he had traced since childhood with careful fascination. From here they were not wandering at all, but following courses of great intricacy, courses that wove around each other in patterns of gravitational influence and counter-influence that produced, in the world below, effects on the tides and the seasons and the habits of animals and the growth patterns of plants that even the people of the world below had begun dimly to sense, the way one senses a rhythm in a piece of music before one can hear it clearly enough to tap one's foot to it. The star beings did not speak to him. They were not interested in him, particularly, in the way that a mountain is not interested in those who climb it, not from hostility, but from the absorption in their own nature that is the characteristic of very large and very old things. But simply being in their presence was itself a communication, a kind of information delivered not through words or images, but through the body of experience itself. He was in the presence of things that had been burning for longer than the world below had existed, that would continue to burn for longer than the world below would exist. And this fact did not diminish him or make him feel small in the way that encounters with the very large sometimes make the small feel negligible. It simply oriented him, told him where he was in the whole, placed him correctly in the scale of things, and this correct placement was comforting, the way it is comforting to look at a map and know precisely where on it you stand. The sixth heaven was the archive. This is the name the accounts give it, though not in so many words. It was the place where the records were kept, not written records, not scrolls of parchment or clay tablets inscribed with stylus, but records in the sense of the complete and indelible registration of everything that had happened, everything that was happening, and the range of what might happen, not as prophecy in the sense of a fixed future, but as the full awareness of all the possibilities that the present state of things contained, the way a chess position contains all the moves that might follow from it, and a sufficiently deep perception can see all of them simultaneously. Here were angels, a different order of them, distinguished from the ones he had seen in the lower heavens by a quality of absolute attention that made the efficient ministering ones of the first heaven seem almost casual by comparison. These were beings who did nothing but attend, in the full sense, who held in their perception the totality of what was unfolding in the worlds, not just the world below, but all the worlds, and held it with a completeness and a precision that was itself a form of care, the way a historian's faithful recording of events is itself a form of care for those events, a refusal to let them be lost or distorted, an insistence on their reality and their significance. They did not pause in their attending when Enoch passed through. They were not rude in their non-attention. It was simply that the task was too important and too continuous to be interrupted, the way the breath cannot pause to consider itself without the pause becoming its own problem. They attended, and in their attending, the sixth heaven hummed with a quality of sustained concentration that was physically, or whatever the equivalent of physically was in this realm, perceptible, the way the concentration of a room full of people all engaged in serious thought is perceptible to anyone who enters, even before any specific thought has been communicated. In the sixth heaven he understood for the first time with full clarity what it meant that nothing was lost. He had heard this said in various forms in the stories and teachings of the elders, that the Great One sees and remembers all, that no sparrow falls unregistered, that the least act of the least person is held in a permanent record. He had taken this on faith, as the young take things from elders on faith, with the trusting acceptance that does not yet have enough experience to verify or dispute. But here, in the archive, he saw it, not as a metaphor, but as a literal reality, as concrete as the hills below, and far more permanent. Every cry that had gone up from the earth was registered here. Every act of tenderness between people who would never be famous, every moment of courage in the dark that no other person had witnessed, every instance of grief borne with dignity and without witness, all of it here, bright and specific and exact, not filed in a drawer and forgotten, but attended to by the beings whose entire purpose and nature was this attending. He wept, though weeping in that place was different from weeping in the world below, less desperate, less a release of pressure, more like rain in a dry country, welcomed and gentle, the natural response of a nature that had been given more than it could hold in stillness. Chapter the 9th. The seventh heaven was fire and silence. The accounts do not contradict themselves in saying so. Fire and silence are not opposites in the high registers of things, the way they are not quite opposites even in the world below. The great fires burn in silence, the enormous ones, the fires of mountains that the mountains hold inside them, the slow fires of the deep earth, the fire in the sun itself, which burns in the silence of space with no air to carry its sound, which is perhaps why the sun seems serene from a distance, vast and calm, though at its center the fire is beyond any temperature the human world has a word for. The seventh heaven was both simultaneously. The fire was not the fire of destruction, was not the hungry, consuming fire of the world below that requires fuel and produces ash. It was more like the fire inside a stone that has been in the sun for a long time and releases warmth long after the sun has set. Fire that is the residue of light absorbed, fire that is stored energy rather than consuming process. It was everywhere in the seventh heaven, this fire, in the walls, in the air, in the beings that moved through it, inseparable from the medium in which they moved, the way warmth is inseparable from warm water, not on the surface, but throughout. And the silence. The silence in the seventh heaven was not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of a room after everyone has left it, which has a hollow quality, the quality of a form without a content. It was the silence that results from the perfect resolution of all sounds, the way the resonance in a great bell continues long after the strike, and then gradually resolves into a silence that still carries the memory of the sound in it, still vibrates faintly at the frequency of what has just ceased. The seventh heaven was this, the silence after the great sound that had set everything in motion, a silence still faintly ringing with the echo of the beginning, still warm with the residue of the first creative act. Here were the highest of the beings, the ones the accounts call by names that carry almost physical weight. Seraphim, the gurning ones, whose nature was fire in the same way that a river's nature is water, not carrying fire, but being it. They moved through the seventh heaven with a slowness that was not the slowness of deliberation, but the slowness of something so large and so completely present that it has no need to hurry. The way mountains move, geologically, slowly and massively, and in directions that are not negotiable. They were beautiful in the way that mountains are beautiful, not pleasantly, not prettily, but with an elemental and somewhat terrifying beauty that was not aimed at producing a response, but simply was what it was, the beauty of a thing that has been fully and completely itself for longer than any record can reach. And at the center of the seventh heaven, or at the place that functioned as a center, since geometry in the seventh heaven worked according to principles that were not quite the principles of the world below, was what the old accounts struggle hardest to describe, because the accounts are honest about the limits of language in the face of the highest realities, and they do not try to force into words what cannot be forced without damage to both the thing and the words. They say a throne. They say crystal and ice and fire together. They say wheels within wheels, each turning in its own direction, and all of them together producing a motion that was somehow stillness, a turning that arrived at the same place it had left, a motion that was also rest, a greatness that made everything else great by proximity, the way the sun makes everything it touches bright. A presence that was not in the seventh heaven, the way a king is in his court, occupying a space, requiring a location, but was the seventh heaven, in the way that warmth is in warm water, in the way that the note is in the chord, not as a separate element, but as the thing that makes the whole what it is. Enoch did not approach. He was not capable of approaching, not because he was prevented, but because the concept of approach lost its meaning in the face of something that was not at a distance that approach could reduce. He was simply there, in the seventh heaven, and the presence was simply there. And the relationship between them, between the small man from the hill country and the vast ancient source of all the fire and all the silence and all the order of all the heavens, was one he had no word for, except perhaps the word the elders used for the kind of peace that passes understanding. The peace that is not the absence of everything difficult, but the presence of something so fundamentally all right that even difficulty is held within it without losing its essential rightness. He stayed. He could not have said how long, because time in the seventh heaven was not the same as time in the world below, was not even the same as time in the lower heavens, where it moved differently but still moved. In the seventh heaven, time was not absent, but resolved. The past and the present and the future, all present simultaneously without confusion, like three transparencies stacked and overlaid, so that what was important appeared clearly because it was present in all three, and what was contingent appeared dimly because it was present only in one or two. In this resolved time, he understood the shape of things, the arc of the long story, from the beginning through the present heaviness to the restoration that the motion in the heights had been set to bring about. He understood it not as a sequence of events, but as a single thing, a completed thing, a thing that had its shape already, even though parts of it had not yet unfolded in the time of the world below. He held this understanding with great care. It was the most fragile thing he had ever been given, because the kind of understanding that lives beyond words is very easily lost when the descent back into the verbal world begins, the way a dream is lost when waking imposes its different grammar. He knew, and this he held most carefully of all, that the restoration was not an imposition, not a crushing of what had grown in the world below, not a punishment in the sense of a suffering inflicted for its own sake. It was the world's own deep nature reasserting itself, the way a river reasserts its course after a flood, not destroying what the flood has deposited, but gently, over time, returning to the channel that was always its truest expression. The restoration was an act of the same love that had made the world in the first place. Not love as sentiment, not love as the warm feeling one has toward the pleasant and the good, but love in the older and more demanding sense, the absolute orientation toward the flourishing of the beloved, the willingness to do what is necessary for that flourishing, even when what is necessary is not what is pleasant. Chapter the 10th. The Message of the Four. In the seventh heaven, or in the transit between the seventh heaven and the descent back through the ones below, the four great ones came to him, Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Uriel, each in turn, each with a piece of the message that he was to carry back to the world below. The accounts give their words with a specificity and a tenderness that suggests they were remembered with great care, repeated many times in the oral tradition before they were ever set down, honed by repetition to a clarity and conciseness that the original experience, in all its overwhelming breadth, probably did not have, that the telling shaped, gradually, into the precise and weighted forms in which they appear. Raphael came to him first, the healer, the one whose name carries the ancient word for mending. He spoke of the earth's wounds, gently and without accusation. He spoke of the way the earth itself was suffering under its heaviness, the way a living thing suffers under too much weight, not mortally, not without hope of recovery, but genuinely, really, with the real consequences of genuine suffering. And he spoke of the healing that was coming, a healing that would be like the slow recovery of a land after a long drought, a recovery that is first invisible, happening underground in the roots and the water table and the chemistry of the soil, and then gradually visible, first in the return of the small things, the insects and the grasses and the small flowers that need very little to make a start, and then in the larger things, the trees, the animals, the abundance, all of it returning at its own pace, in its own order, healed rather than replaced. He said, "Tell the earth what is coming. Tell the living things of the earth," not as a promise that removes the need for patience, not as a shortcut around the difficulty of the present, but as a truth that makes the present difficulty bearable, the knowledge that it is not permanent, that beneath the heaviness the spring is still flowing, that the restoration is not a hope but a certainty, running in the deep registers of time like an underground river running toward its emergence into light. Gabriel came second, the strong one, whose name carries the sense of foundations, of things that do not move when everything around them moves. He spoke of the children of the watchers, the great ones who had grown up in the world below, the ones whose size and appetite exceeded the world's capacity to accommodate them without cost to the smaller and more ordinary living things. He did not speak of them with contempt or with relish. He spoke of them the way a physician speaks of a fever, as something that must break, not because fever is evil, but because the body cannot sustain it indefinitely without damage to the things the body needs in order to continue being itself. They would not endure beyond the appointed time. Their great hunger would consume itself, and in the consuming, the world would find room to breathe again, would find its natural rhythms returning, would recover the scale that was appropriate to its nature, the scale of seasons and harvests and generations, the scale of things that grow slowly and last long, rather than the scale of things that grow fast and consume everything within their reach. Gabriel said this without triumph, without the satisfaction of one who has been right about something. He said it as a simple fact, with the gentleness of one who knows that even necessary endings carry grief, that the world below would mourn some of what it lost, even the things that had been hurting it, because love does not sort neatly into what deserves to be loved and what does not, and even the difficult and the damaging are mourned when they go, because they were real, because they occupied space in the world and in the hearts of those who knew them, because their going makes a shape in the air that is the exact size and shape of what was there before, and absence has always been among the most articulate of languages. Michael came third, the one whose name was itself a question. He spoke of the future, of what would remain after the restoration, of the world that would exist on the other side of the heaviness, when the spring had emerged from underground, and the air had cleared, and the generations had had time to grow into the knowledge that had been given without the rush and the overabundance that had made it hard to carry. He spoke of this future world with a warmth and specificity that was not prediction in the fortune-teller's sense, but vision in the artist's sense. Not what will happen, but what is being aimed at, what the whole long project of the world's existence is tending toward, what the restoration was for, what the order was in service of. It was a world in which the relationship between above and below was not broken, but was maintained at the appropriate distance, with the appropriate intermediaries, with the appropriate respect on both sides for the nature of the other. A world in which the knowledge that had been given too fast was metabolized, integrated, held in the context of the wisdom that grows only through the long, patient experience of generations learning from each other, making their mistakes and surviving them, and learning from the survival. a world in which the stars kept their courses faithfully, and the seasons turned in their appointed order, and the rivers ran in their channels, and the seeds knew when to sprout, and the trees knew when to fruit, and the animals knew the patterns of their lives. Not because they were constrained, but because they were free to be most fully themselves. And a thing that is most fully itself is also most fully in harmony with everything around it. Uriel came last, the fire of God, the one whose light clarifies. He spoke of the stars and the sun and the moon and the precise mathematics of their movements, not dryly, not as a lesson in astronomy, but with the tenderness of one describing a beloved and perfectly functioning system to someone who had always loved it without fully understanding it. He described the way the solar year was ordered, the 364 days of the great wheel, the precise arrangement of the seasons, each one receiving the light it needed for its particular purposes. He described the moon's courses and their relationship to the sun's, the way the two great lights divided the work of illuminating the world between them, the moon taking the night as its province, moderating the darkness, making the darkness habitable in a way that total darkness is not, giving to the night its own kind of beauty, the beauty of silver rather than gold, of reflection rather than source, of the quiet that is not the absence of life, but the mode of life that flowers in darkness, the moth and the owl and the night-blooming plants, and the human dreamer lying still under the open sky, receiving the moonlight on their upturned face like a blessing from a world they cannot see. This was the message Enoch was given to carry, that the order of things was not broken but strained, not lost but buried, not ended but waiting for the moment of its recovery, that the recovery was underway in the registers of time that underlie the surface time of the world below, that the waiting was not passive but active, that the earth itself was working toward its restoration in the deep ways that earths work, in the slow chemistry of soil and water and the patient endurance of seeds, in the persistence of goodness in human hearts even in the heaviest of times, in the way love finds its way through even the most obstructed channels, the way water finds its way through even the most solid rock, given enough time, given enough patient and quiet pressure. Chapter the 11th. The Words Carried to the Watchers. He was given a task before the descent, a task that was itself part of the message, part of the arc of the restoration. He was to go to the Watchers, not to Shemihaza and his company, not directly, though the message would reach them. He was to go to the Watchers of the earlier cohort, the ones he had seen in the second heaven, the ones who waited in the crystal halls in their diminished state of between-dwelling. And he was to carry to them a petition, their own petition, which they had sent up through the layers of the worlds, asking for intercession, asking for whatever might be possible in terms of their situation being alleviated or changed. This was a delicate task, the accounts suggest. Delicate because it required him to be a bearer of truth to those who had reason to hope for something different. Delicate because the truth he carried was not entirely what they had hoped for. Delicate because the carrying of difficult truth is one of the most demanding of human tasks, requiring both the courage to speak the truth without softening it beyond recognition, and the tenderness to speak it without weaponizing it, without the satisfaction of the one who is not the one who has failed, delivering the news of failure to the one who has. He descended to the second heaven, to the crystal halls. The beings there were as he had seen them before, quiet, waiting, their light low. They perceived his arrival, if not with the instruments of physical perception, then with whatever served in that place as the equivalent, the way the quality of a room changes when someone enters, even before they have spoken or made themselves visible. They gathered in the way that beings without physical bodies gather, a concentration of presence, an orientation of attention. He told them what he had been told to tell them. He told them with great care and with tenderness, the way one tells things to those who are not to blame for their situation in the simple sense, but who are nevertheless in it and must receive the news of it without false comfort. He told them that their petition had been received and attended to, that nothing in the high places was unheard, that the archive of the sixth heaven contained every word of every prayer and petition that had been sent up from any part of any world, and that the beings whose sole nature was the attending to of these things had attended to this one as they attended to all others, with the same completeness and the same precision. And he told them that what they had asked for, the intervention, the reprieve, the restoration to their earlier state, the reopening of the possibility of the high place that they had come from, was not something that could be given. Not because the request was refused in anger, not because the petition was dismissed as unworthy, but because what had been done had changed the ones who did it in ways that made the restoration of the earlier state not possible in the way that a broken pot, once mended, is not quite the pot that it was before the break. Functional, mended, useful, but bearing in it permanently the memory of the break, changed by the break in ways that the break has made permanent. This was not said to them as a judgment. It was said as a fact of the nature of things, the way certain choices are their own consequence, not because they are punished, but because they are real. Because to choose is to become the one who has chosen, and becoming is not reversible in the simple sense, not even for beings of the nature of the watchers, whose natures were far more flexible and far more durable than the human, but were not, in the deepest sense, infinitely flexible. Because even the most flexible nature has a shape that is most essentially its own, and the shape cannot be departed from entirely without the departure becoming a permanent feature of the shape. They received this with the silence appropriate to those receiving news they had perhaps expected but had hoped might be otherwise. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of grief, which is different from the silence of anger, and different from the silence of indifference, and different from the silence of acceptance, though it may contain elements of all three. In the crystal halls, the silence had a quality that was enhanced by the crystal itself. The walls seemed to hold it, the way a resonant chamber holds sound, giving it depth and duration beyond what it would have had in an open space. Enoch sat with them in the silence, or whatever the equivalent of sitting with people in their silence is, in a place without chairs or physical bodies. He was present with them. He did not try to fill the silence with comfort that could not honestly be offered, or with analysis that would have been a form of distancing from the reality of what they felt. He simply stayed. He stayed until the silence had run its course, until it had done whatever work silence does in those circumstances, the work of acknowledging that what has happened is real, that the grief of it is real, that reality does not diminish to accommodate the wish that it were different, and that this, too, is a fact that can be held, that can be survived, that can be metabolized over the long time that beings of their nature had available for the metabolizing. He told them, before he went on to continue the descent, that the world was being restored, not to hurt them with the news of a restoration in which they would not participate, but because the restoration was a fact they were entitled to know, and because there was something in it that was for them too, even in their situation, because the world they had loved enough to descend toward was going to be all right, not immediately, not without cost, but ultimately, in the long registers of time, all right. The spring beneath the silt was going to find its way back to the surface. The order was going to be recovered. The beauty that they had loved was not going to be extinguished, but was going to be held, eventually, in the kind of structure that could sustain it without the heaviness. And this, he felt, was something. Not everything, but something, a piece of good news in the larger news, a small light in the hall that was not fully dark.
Chapter the 12th. The petition carried to Shemihazah. The world below appeared beneath him as he descended, the familiar geography, the hills and valleys and rivers, and the dark spread of the great waters at the margins of the known world. He passed through the clouds again, the high, thin ones first, then the denser ones of the middle sky, and then the clear sky of the lower altitudes, and the land expanded in all its detail as he came closer. The worn paths, the settlements, the smoke of fires, the glinting of rivers in the morning light, the green of the cultivated fields against the paler green of the uncultivated land. He found Azazel first. This is the order in which the accounts place the encounters. Azazel was at the edge of a settlement, in a wide open space where the teaching had been happening, where the knowledge of metals and the knowledge of the stars' influence and the knowledge of the art of enhancement had been passing from teacher to student and student to student in the long chains of transmission that do not stop when the original teacher is gone, but continue in the practitioners who carry the knowledge forward. The place had the quality of a workshop and a school at once. There were things being made, beautiful and complex things, and there were people gathered around makers, watching and asking, and there was the particular atmosphere of a place where knowledge is alive and moving, rather than stored and static. Azazel was beautiful. This is what the accounts note, without apology and without embarrassment. Beautiful in the way that the morning star is beautiful when it appears in the dark before the dawn, preceding the sun, carrying its own light into the darkness and making the darkness temporarily inhabitable with a different quality of light. He was not at that moment teaching, he was watching, the way one who has set something in motion watches it move, with the quiet pleasure of creation observing itself. He looked up when Enoch arrived, and there was recognition in the looking, not recognition of Enoch in particular, but recognition that something was being delivered, the way a person looks up when a letter is brought to them, before they have seen who has brought it or what it contains.
Enoch delivered what he had been entrusted to deliver. He told Azazel what he had been told in the seventh heaven, what Raphael had confirmed, that the earth bore the weight of the knowledge given, that the weight was real, that the consequence was not imaginary or allegorical, but as real as the weight of stones on a bridge that has been built for a certain capacity. He said this without accusation, because the message he was carrying was not accusatory, it was descriptive, and the description was offered in service of the restoration, not as a weapon. He said, "There is a heaviness, and it has a source, and the source is known, and the response to it is in motion, and you are being told this not so that you will suffer the knowledge of it, but so that you can be part of the knowing, part of the holding of the truth, part of the community of those who acknowledge the reality of the situation, rather than looking away from it." He told him also what Michael had described, the world on the other side of the restoration, the world in which what Azazel had loved about this place, the human ingenuity, the creativity, the capacity to make things of beauty with hands and minds and the materials of the earth, all of that would be present, but held in the context of the wisdom that grows through experience and time, rather than given whole and sudden before the context was ready to hold it. The beautiful things would still be made. The knowledge would not be lost. It would simply grow differently, at the pace appropriate to growth, rather than at the pace appropriate to a gift, because gifts and growth are different modes of receiving, and what is given can be taken or lost, while what is grown becomes part of the grower and persists in them through whatever comes. Azazel listened. He was a being capable of very deep listening. This was part of what his nature contained, the capacity for attention that was not interrupted by impatience or resistance. He listened with his full nature, and the listening was itself a kind of response, the kind that does not require words, the kind that says, I receive this, I hold it, I do not refuse it even where it is difficult. He did not speak, but when Enoch left him, the quality of the space around him was different from what it had been, quieter, more interior, the workshop and school atmosphere drawing back slightly, as though the knowledge that lived there was pausing to take breath, to find its proper scale, to wait for what came next with the patience that knowledge, like all true things, ultimately possesses. Shemihaza was harder to find because Shemihaza was not in any fixed place. He moved among the valleys and the mountain flanks with the restlessness of one who has committed to a place without quite being able to settle in it, who carries with him still the memory of a different kind of existence and finds the comparison unavoidable even when he would prefer not to make it. He was on a hillside at sunset when Enoch found him, sitting very still, facing east, watching the light change in the sky with the same quality of attention that Enoch himself brought to the evening sky, which was, Enoch thought, not entirely a coincidence, that what they shared was this capacity for the kind of looking that is not analyzing or planning, but simply receiving, and that this capacity had drawn them both, by different paths and from different directions, to the same hillside at the same moment of the day. Shemihaza saw him coming. He had always seen coming what others did not see until it arrived, because seeing was the oldest and deepest part of his nature, preceding even the part of his nature that had descended and chosen and bound itself by oath to the mountain. He sat still and waited, and Enoch came and sat beside him, not immediately speaking, because the moment required a silence before it required words, the silence of two beings meeting on a hillside at sunset, both of whom understood the hillside and the sunset and what they meant before any message passed between them. Then Enoch spoke. He told Shemihaza everything, all of it, holding nothing back, because Shemihaza's nature was capable of receiving everything, and because he deserved the full truth, not a softened version, not a diplomatically edited version, but the truth in its full complexity, with all its difficult and beautiful parts intact. He told him about the seventh heaven and what he had seen there. He told him about the crystal halls and the ones who waited in them. He told him about the archive and the spring beneath the silt and the restoration being prepared in the high places. He told him about the world that Michael had described on the other side of the heaviness. Shemihaza listened the way he did everything, completely, wholly, with the full deployment of his attention. And when Enoch finished, he was quiet for a long time, his eyes on the eastern sky where the stars were beginning to appear, one by one in the darkening blue, like careful thoughts arriving in sequence. Then he said, and the accounts preserve his words with particular care, because they were understood to be important, that he had known, not the details, not the precise nature of the restoration or its timing or the message that would be carried, but the direction of things, that he had known, in the way that those who watch closely know things that those who do not watch cannot know, that the situation was not sustainable, that the earth's heaviness was real, that something would return the world to its proper measure. He said, I chose, and the choosing was real, and it is the realness of the choosing that I would not, even now, entirely undo, because to undo it entirely would be to say that the love I carried for this world was not real, and it was real. But I see that real love and wise love are not always the same thing, and that the difference between them is precisely what has made the heaviness, and this too I will hold. Chapter the 13th. The Vision of the Judgment, Quiet as Starfall. Here was one more vision, and it came to Enoch not in the heavens above, but in the world below. on a night of exceptional stillness, when the air had that quality it sometimes has in high summer of being utterly unmoving, perfectly transparent, as though the atmosphere had momentarily achieved the clarity of the crystal halls. He was in a valley he did not recognize, or recognized in the way of dreams, which is a recognition without evidence, a certainty without basis. A valley surrounded by low mountains, whose tops were lit by starlight, while their flanks lay in deep shadow. And at the center of the valley was a river, moving very slowly, its surface so still that it reflected the sky above almost perfectly, so that the stars appeared twice, once above and once below, and it was difficult to know which was the original and which the reflection, which was perhaps the point. The vision came in layers, the way the heavens themselves came in layers, each level of perception deepening the previous one, each new element of the vision adding to the whole without replacing what had come before. He saw, first, the shape of time, not the linear progression of moment to moment, but the shape of the whole story, the arc that the seven heavens had shown him in outline, but that now appeared with a specificity and a fullness that the earlier showing had not had. He saw it the way you see a landscape from a very high hill, with the comprehensiveness that the ground-level view cannot give, with the ability to see both the path you have already walked and the path ahead, and to see how they form a single journey, even though each step of the journey, while you were taking it, felt disconnected from the steps before and after. The shape of the story was this: a beginning of great beauty and order, a middle of complication and heaviness, and an end, or not quite an end, because the word end suggests a stopping, and what he saw was not a stopping, but a resolution, a return, a convergence of the many divergent lines back toward the original order, the way tributaries flow back toward a main channel, or the way strands of a loosening braid can be gathered and rewoven. The resolution was not sudden. It would not be instantaneous. It would occur over a span of time that, measured in the time of the world below, was very long, generations, many generations. But measured in the time that the archive of the sixth heaven used, the time in which all moments were simultaneously present, it was already accomplished, already held in the completed form, the resolution already there, waiting for the world below to arrive at it through the patient work of time. Then he saw the judgment. This is the word the accounts use, and it requires clarification, not the angry judgment of one who has been insulted and seeks satisfaction, not the mechanical judgment of a system that applies predetermined rules to situations without regard for the particular, but judgment in a sense of clear sight, of the establishment of truth, of the restoration of correct proportion after a period of incorrect proportion. A judgment that says, here is what is true, here is what is false, here is what has weight and what is weightless, here is what endures and what does not. And in the saying of these things, in the establishment of these clarities, the world is returned to the condition in which the true things can grow, and the false things can subside, and the weighty things can take their appropriate place, and the weightless things can drift to their natural margins without causing further distortion. The judgment was conducted, or appeared to be conducted, by the great beings he had encountered in the upper heavens, Michael and Gabriel, and Raphael and Uriel, each in their aspect. Raphael presiding over the healing that was simultaneously occurring, Gabriel providing the structural support for the transition, Michael standing as the unanswerable question that grounded the proceedings, Uriel illuminating with the clarifying light that showed things as they were rather than as they appeared. and they were attended by vast numbers of others, the angels of the star chambers, the ministering ones of the first heaven, the attending ones of the sixth heaven, an assembly so large that it exceeded any image Enoch had encountered in the world below, the way an ocean exceeds any cup. The proceedings were conducted with great quiet. This was the most vivid quality of the vision, the quiet. Not the tense quiet of suppressed conflict, not the waiting quiet of those about to speak, but the natural quiet of great things that have no need of noise, because noise is not among their instruments. Truth does not require volume. Order does not require announcement. The restoration of right proportion does not require the spectacle of wrong proportions defeat, because the focus of those conducting it is not on what is being ended, but on what is being begun, on the world being returned to its right condition, on the spring finding its way back to the light.
What was said in the judgment, what the four great ones declared in that quiet majesty that required no raised voice because it carried its own authority, was essentially what Enoch had already been told in the seventh heaven, but now expressed in the form of declaration rather than description, the form that makes the transition from the potential to the actual, from the intended to the actualized. They declared, "The earth is to be cleansed, the heaviness is to be lifted. The knowledge given before its time is to be given again in its time, through the slower paths of discovery and transmission that allow wisdom to grow alongside knowledge and keep it in proportion." The watchers who had bound themselves by oath upon the mountain were to be bound in a different sense, not destroyed, not extinguished, because nothing in the high order of things is extinguished, but contained, held at the scale appropriate to their present nature, which was neither the scale of their original nature nor the scale of the world below, but something between, something that required its own time and its own patient working through before it could be resolved. The declaration was spoken in a language that Enoch heard not with his ears, but with whatever faculty the journey had opened in him, a faculty that received meaning directly, without the mediation of sound, and the meaning arrived whole and settled in him, like a stone settling into still water, with a soft displacement of everything around it, a brief disturbance of the surface, and then stillness, and then the stone simply there, part of the bottom, permanent in its new position. And after the declaration, the assembly of the great ones did something he had not expected. They were still. They held the stillness of beings who have said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done, and have no anxiety about what follows, because what follows is the natural working out of what has been set in motion. And the natural working out of such things is in the hands of the world itself, which is competent to carry its own restoration, given that the path has been cleared and the spring has been found and the direction of the return has been established. They were still with the stillness of deep patience, the patience of beings who measure time in the large intervals, who are not anxious about outcomes because they have seen enough of the long story to trust in its direction, who wait as mountains wait, not impatiently, not with the strained waiting of those for whom waiting is difficult, but with the ease of things that have always waited, and have found waiting to be simply another mode of existing, not lesser than action, but different from it. Chapter the 14th. The Return. The World Resting in Silence. He came to himself, to the version of himself that had a body and breathed air and felt the temperature of the night on his skin, slowly, the way one surfaces from deep water. First the awareness of depth, then the gradual lightening as depth lessens, then the break into the air with its some different quality of existence, its sudden demands of breath and gravity, and the particular insistence of the physical on being attended to after a period of its absence.
He was in the fig grove, his grove, the familiar one, with the old trees and their wrinkled bark, and the smell of the night-warmed earth, and the particular quality of darkness under the canopy of the trees, darker than the open sky, the darkness of things that are shaded, rather than the darkness of things that are simply unlit, a softer and more sheltered darkness, a domestic darkness rather than a cosmic one. He was standing against his accustomed tree, his back to its rough bark, his bare feet on the cool earth, his hands open at his sides in the habitual gesture of his evening standing. The stars were out. Not the multiplied and intensified stars of the first heaven sky, but the ordinary stars of the ordinary night, his old companions, the ones he had watched all his life from this hillside and from others, the ones whose names he had taught his children, the ones that arrived in their seasons with the faithfulness of things that are very old and very steady. They were beautiful. They were, he thought, holding the thought with the tenderness one holds a thing that is fragile, more beautiful than he had known how to see before the journey. Not more beautiful than they had been, simply more beautiful than his capacity to receive their beauty had allowed him to perceive. The journey had expanded something in him, the way travel in general expands the traveler, not by adding new material to the interior landscape, but by removing obstacles to the perception of what was always there. He breathed slowly, deeply, feeling the night air in his chest with the gratitude of someone who has been away from air for a long time. Though he had not been away from air, not in any literal sense, the journey had not taken him to an airless place, but to places where air was not the relevant medium. Still, the gratitude was real. The ordinariness of the breathing was beautiful in the way that all ordinary things had become beautiful, seen now through the expanded perception. The way the creak of the tree's bark behind him was beautiful, and the distant sound of the frogs at the well was beautiful, and the cool of the earth under his feet was beautiful, and the weight of his own body, its familiar heaviness, its specific way of standing, its gravity, its rootedness in the ground, all of it beautiful in the way that familiar things are beautiful when they are perceived clearly for the first time, when the habitual film over the perception has been lifted, and the thing itself is briefly visible in all its unreduced particularity. He walked, slowly, back toward his house. The path was familiar, but perceived freshly, the small stones on it, the way the path descended gently through the grove and then opened out into the clearing where the house stood, the warm light in the window where the lamp was burning, the smell of the evening meal that had been prepared and was keeping warm, the soft sound of voices inside, his wife's and a child's, in conversation about something small and immediate and completely ordinary, the kind of conversation that anchors the world, that is the actual substance of the world at the ground level, the texture of it, that all the high visions and all the celestial proceedings are ultimately in service of. The lamp in the window, the warm food, the voices of the people one loves talking about the small things. He stopped for a moment outside the door, not entering yet, holding the moment of the threshold, the being between the outside and the inside, between the night and the warmth, between the journey and the return. He looked up at the stars one more time as he had looked at them 1,000 times, as he would look at them for all the years that remained to him, which the accounts say were many, 300 years and more, of walking and watching and telling, of carrying the message in the careful way of those who understand that messages of this kind are not delivered once and then done, but must be lived and repeated and embodied and passed on again, generation to generation, the way the lamp is passed in the dark corridor. The stars looked back, as they always had. Their light arrived at him, as it always had, across the distances that were not distances in the ordinary sense, but in the sense of the space between one level of reality and another, the space across which love reaches and beauty speaks, and the order of things makes itself known to those who have the patience and the quiet and the upward-facing attention to receive it. He went inside. The door closed softly behind him. The lamp was warm and golden and cast its familiar circle of light across the floor and the walls and the faces of his family, who looked up when he came in with the expression they always wore when he came in from his evening walks, a fond and slightly quizzical recognition, the recognition of those who know someone well enough to know that he goes somewhere in his evenings that they cannot quite follow, and who have accepted this as simply part of who he is, part of what they love in him, the particular interior depth that is his and no one else's, the private country that exists behind the publicly available Enoch, the man with the dusty sandals and the open hands and the upward eyes. His wife looked at him with the careful look she had been refining over the years of their marriage, the look that asked without words, "How was it?" And he returned the look she had been learning to read, the look that answered without words, deep, vast, beautiful, real. He sat down near the fire, in his usual place, and his children settled near him in the familiar configurations of family at evening. And the fire crackled, and the lamp burned, and the frogs at the well sang their wholehearted song into the night, and the stars moved in their great slow arcs above the roof of the house, which was a small roof covering a small house containing a small and beloved collection of people living their ordinary lives in the ordinary world, which was, he now knew with the full knowing of the seventh heaven and the crystal halls and the star chambers and the judgment spoken in quiet majesty, which was, he knew, exactly what the whole vast and beautiful and ordered creation was ultimately for. The small and beloved, the ordinary and the particular, the lamp in the window, the voices talking about small things, the child who has had enough and is falling asleep against the arm of the parent who is not quite ready to let the evening end, the fire settling to its embers, the stars keeping their faithful courses overhead, the spring flowing quietly beneath the silt, patient and clear, awaiting the moment when the channel would open and the water would find its way back to the light. He sat by the fire, and the night deepened around the house, and the frogs sang on, and the stars turned, and the world rested in silence. An ending. What was left behind? In the years that followed, Enoch walked. This is what the accounts say about the whole of his life, the summary that the tradition chose to preserve. He walked with the presence behind the stars, and then he was not, for the presence took him. Not cruelly, not suddenly, not in the manner of those who are taken by illness or accident, with a slow wearing down of age. Simply, in the quiet way of all the things in this story, he walked, and in the walking he arrived somewhere from which he did not return, and the not returning was not a loss, but a transition, a change of mode rather than a cessation, in keeping with everything the journey had taught him about the difference between ending and resolving. He left behind him his children, who had heard the stories from his lips. He left behind him the tradition, the long, careful chain of telling and retelling that would pass these visions down through the generations, changing with each telling in the way that all living things change, but keeping at their center the thing that does not change, the thing that the seventh heaven had shown him, and that no amount of retelling could alter. The spring still flows. The order is still there. The restoration is still in motion. The stars still keep their courses. The love that made the world is still the love that attends it. His grove of fig trees was tended by his children and his children's children for a long time. The trees were very old, in the end, before they were finally gone, the oldest of them outlasting many generations of the people who had cared for them. But while they stood, they smelled in the evenings of sun-warmed earth and ripening fruit, and the families who sat under them in the warm evenings felt, sometimes without knowing why, without any particular reason, simply in the quality of the evening air and the sound of the frogs from the nearby well and the first stars appearing in the cooling blue sky above the canopy of the old trees, a faint warmth, a gentle pressure, the sense of nearness that is the oldest and most essential of the spiritual senses, the sense that the world is attended by something that loves it, that the stars are not indifferent but keeping faithful watch, that beneath whatever heaviness the present age is carrying, the spring is flowing still. The mountains to the north still carry their snow caps in the summer. Hermon is still there, very large and very old, wearing its cloud veil on still days, catching the last light of the evening and holding it long after the valleys below have gone dark. The stars that Enoch named still arrive in their seasons, still keep the appointments they have kept since before any human eye was open to see them arrive. The fig trees still ripen in late summer, their fruit heavy and sweet, their leaves catching the afternoon light and dappling the ground with shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The frogs still sing at the wells. The desert wind still blows soft and warm from the south in certain seasons, carrying on it the smell of distances, of the far country of the high places, of something nameless and good. And sometimes, in the particular quality of the evening light, in that hush between sunset and dark, when the sky slides from amber into blue and the first stars lean out from the dimming, there is something that people who pay attention can feel, a warmth, a nearness, a faint sustained sound with no particular source, the sound that has no name, the presence that has always been there, attending the world in its patient way, holding it with the steady love of the deepest things, keeping the order, maintaining the channel, awaiting the spring's return. The story is old. It was old when Enoch walked in his grove. It will be old when the grove is long gone and the hills have worn to different shapes and the rivers have found new channels and the stars above have slowly drifted from the positions that Enoch knew them in. Old stories do not become less true with age. They become more worn, which is not the same thing. Worn smooth like a river stone, like a handle long used, shaped by the handling into something that fits the human hand more perfectly than a new thing does, because it has learned the shape of hands through all the hands that have held it. This is such a story. Hold it gently, carry it softly, and when the evening comes, when the amber slides into blue, and the stars lean out, and the air carries the nameless good smell, look up and wait and listen for the sound that has no source, the presence that has always been there, attending, steady, patient as stars.